Hello everybody, this is Albert with Green Tea House. I hope you're doing well today. Today we're going to talk about caffeine levels in tea and one of the determining factors behind this. Now before I begin, I highly recommend you check out our back catalog of episodes, in particular the episodes that deal with the fundamentals of tea. What is green tea? What is black tea? Also, what's the best temperature to steep your teas? Should you reuse your leaves and so forth? And I'll make sure I put some germane ones up here. Caffeine. This is very important. Look, caffeine is the most used stimulant in the world. We know that tea has it. We do have an episode here, I think it's called 6 Factors That Affect Caffeine Level in Your Tea. And we'll review some of those things there, but I want to talk about another determining factor that I think is important that I did not really mention as much in the first episode. But we know tea has caffeine. Now, why does tea have caffeine? Why do coffee beans have caffeine? Why do cacao beans, where chocolate comes from, have caffeine? So caffeine is secreted, and we'll talk about the Camellia sinensis plant. Caffeine is secreted as a way to protect the plant from insects. It's their own defense mechanism. And the most caffeine you're going to find in the Camellia sinensis plant is going to be in the buds, in the little babies that are growing, because understandably so, they're more vulnerable than the more mature leaves that are further down. We also know what? That caffeine levels in tea as a whole, and we talked about this in the episode that coffee lovers won't like, 3 reasons why you should drink tea over coffee. But we've talked about it there that as a whole, tea has less caffeine than coffee as a whole. There are going to be some exceptions, not really a lot. Gyokuro is probably the main one where there's certain cultivars of Gyokuro, the Japanese green tea, that can be around the same level, if not even higher than a standard cup of coffee. But as a whole, even teas that we say are high in caffeine are still going to be 2/3 lower than the caffeine level in a cup of coffee. So understand when we use the term, oh, this tea has light caffeine, moderate caffeine, or high, all of those are still lower than the amount of caffeine that you'd find in a coffee. And typically, like in a cup of coffee, you'll find about 90 milligrams of caffeine. Even in something higher, and we'll talk about one of the determining factors here, it's maybe going to be 65 to 70 milligrams, and it's not going to be that high. Aside from Gyokuro, which can be around 90 to 100, tea is much lower, and that's one of the reasons I would recommend you drink it. Also because theanine is in it, it steadies the caffeine release throughout the day instead of the way it is in coffee where you spike and you crash and spike and crash. Either way, quick review. What are some ways to affect caffeine level in your tea? Obviously, the big one is the amount of teas in the tea leaves that you use, right? If you're using 4 scoops of something, it's going to have more caffeine than 1 scoop. Another one is going to be how long you're steeping. The longer you steep it, it extracts more of the caffeine out than if you steep for a minute. Another one is going to be temperature. The hotter the temperature as a whole, the more caffeine that you're going to get out of those things. Now, doesn't mean it's going to taste as good, especially in something like green tea, which is very sensitive. I always talk about how it's like a moody teenager. It's very sensitive. And you got to steep that around, I would say, about 170. That's a good average for green tea. But in general, if you're steeping something hotter, it's going to have more caffeine levels. Okay, so those are 3 or 4 big ones. Now, what's another way to determine caffeine levels? Where in the plant are you getting the leaves and infusing them? As I mentioned at the beginning, that the babies, the little buds, have more caffeine because caffeine is used as a way to protect the leaf from insects eating it. And there is an example. You look at a tea, an oolong called Oriental Beauty, it goes by other names, that's grown in Taiwan mostly, how there is an insect that will sit on it, and as a response, it's commonly misunderstood it bites the leaves. It doesn't bite the leaves. It sits on it. As a response, the tea leaves secrete another chemical that then affects the actual taste of Oriental Beauty, which makes it a very unique tea, and it's a tea that we do sell. But in general, the buds are going to have more caffeine, and then there's ways that we hack it, especially in Japan, by shading these plants to increase the caffeine level in these buds. And this is normally going to be in the case of matcha and Gyokuro. So the buds are going to have more caffeine than the more mature leaves that are underneath it, and then the real old mature leaves that are underneath that near the bottom, and then much less caffeine than the branches and the twigs. So when you're looking at your tea, it helps, kind of good rule of thumb to know, where is it coming from? So I'll give you some examples. Gyokuro, matcha, which is grounded up leaves. Those are going to be high in caffeine because those are from the buds. If you look at something on the black level, Darjeelings, first flush, second flush, we saw both of these. Those tend to be from the buds. Yes, they're fully oxidized because they're black tea. You could go to those episodes, but they're going to have more caffeine because they're from the buds. Now, let's look at pu'er. Pu'er as a whole, there's exceptions. Pu'er as a whole, fermented dark tea, is from lower level, the more mature leaves, therefore less caffeine, vis-a-vis the teas that I mentioned that come from the buds. You look at oolong. The majority of oolongs, which is my favorite category of tea out of the 6 categories, tend to come from the mature leaves, and they're harvested later in the season, therefore the caffeine level is less. And then you can look at teas that come from the stems and the branches. You look at kukicha. Kukicha it's a pretty popular drink in Japan. That tea is pretty much just the stems and the branches, so it's got like pretty much no caffeine. But this is a drink that is a unique taste. I like it. It's not one of my favorite Japanese green teas, but people drink it in Japan and across the world, and you can drink it at night because it has pretty much no caffeine at all. You look at something like hojicha. Hojicha is a roasted, pan-fired Japanese green tea. That's another one that's going to have more branches and stems, therefore lower in caffeine. You look at genmaicha, so we're on a good Japanese run. Genmaicha is 50% Japanese green tea, but then 50% of it is rice. And because it's rice, half and half, that in general is going to have less caffeine. So another good example, we're going to look at 2 white teas that we sell. And I think this kind of illustrates the point. White peony and silver needle. These are arguably the 2 most popular white teas out there. I'm going to treat my pour before it gets cold here. And I'll show you a picture of these to juxtapose. Silver needle, we sell a jasmine silver needle. Silver needle comes from the buds. I mean, that is classic silver needle. And this is why it's one of the most prized teas in the world, but certainly in the white tea world, it is the high-end white tea white tea. And this comes from the buds. And as I mentioned in the episode on white teas, what are white teas? They just pluck them and leave them in the sun for a long time. And so it's almost like the most pristine tea that you can drink. And so in white tea, silver needle white tea tends to have a lot more caffeine, just like the Darjeeling, because that comes from the buds, just like matcha and gyokuro, because those come from the buds. So again, you see a reoccurring theme that regardless of what category you're in of the 6 categories, those that are plucked from the buds tend to have more caffeine than those are plucked from the more mature leaves, or of course from the branches and the stems. Then you look at white peony. Some white peony you will get just from the buds, but most white peony is going to have some buds, and then it's going to have some branches and some more mature leaves. So you can look at the picture here as I put them side to side. Our white peony, you can tell, has the branches and so forth. Therefore, white peony is going to have a lower caffeine level than our silver needle, because silver needle comes from the buds. So in closing, most of the time, you're not going to be like looking up in some encyclopedia of tea. Does this one come from the buds, or this one comes down from lower in the tea leaves? This episode is just more like learning about the beauty of tea and just understanding that there's a lot of things that affect the caffeine level in tea, and one of them is where we are plucking the leaves. Guys, post in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care and God bless.